Today I will be talking about the QandA, the QandA, on the 20th of February 2017. It is entitled on the ABC website. There will be a link down below. The title is Pensions, Debt and NDIS. The panelists were George Brandis, Attorney General, Tanya Plibersek, Deputy Opposition Leader, Julian Burnside, Barrister and Human Rights Advocate, Piers, Akerman, Political Commentator, Michele, Levine, CEO, Roy Morgan Research. So a few things I wanted to talk about today, a couple of little facts I wanted to check. One of them, the first point of discussion was political entitlements versus disability. A lady in the crowd brought up why am I being checked over whether or not I am eligible for disability when politicians receive so many entitlements? Why are they looking to shave money from disability and pensions when they could be shaving money from people such as politicians? That was the point she was making. So there's some pretty standard points that people started talking about. So what George Brandis was talking about in this segment was that people receiving disability should only do so if they are unable to work. So he wants people who are unable to work to continue receiving disability presumably for all the reasons that we can imagine, that it will, not only is it the moral thing to do and help them provide for themselves, there'll be less of a burden on the rest of society. Perhaps they'll be able to aid in their own recovery and building up their own self-sufficiency, all these kinds of things. And that's exactly what the lady in the audience said she was doing. She helped. So her daughter was her carer, and she helped she supported her daughter and her children, put them through school. Her daughter now wants to study, become a doctor, and is going to contribute to society. Those are all. It was a really beautiful story by her. It was kind of heart-wrenching a little bit, but I just wanted to point out that that's ultimately what welfare is about. So George Brandis is saying we want to kick off the people who are able to work. But the point about welfare is it's also helping to enable people to work and put them in a position where they can work. And I don't think there's too much controversy in our political landscape about means testing and making sure that so-called bludgers aren't getting what they don't deserve. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Piers Akerman, when asked to weigh in on this topic, brought up an interesting statistic. And it sounded like a bit of a scare statistic, so I thought I'd fact check it. So he claimed that only around 50% of people were paying the tax and supporting everybody else in society. So if we looked, so I fact checked it, and if we look into the actual data, we find that people between the ages of 18 and 65, it's around about 65% of people who are paying taxes. The other people, fall short of the threshold. They're not working, they're receiving welfare or what have you. So I was trying to figure out where he got his 50% number from. It sounds like it would be a strange thing for a political commentator to just make up. So I imagine to get to 50%, he has to reach out. He has to include people from outside that bracket. So people under the age of 18 and people over the age of 65. A lot of people under the age of 18 will be supported by their parents. Some people will be supported by the government. Over the age of 65, many people are supported by the government. Many will still be self-sufficient, but I imagine he's getting to that 50% number. But I think it's a little disingenuous because I don't think there's any. I can't imagine. Oh, maybe there is. Maybe there is some talk about not wanting to provide the pension and Social Security to people of past retirement age. Especially given that the current government is increasing the age of retirement. I believe it's up to 67 soon. But it sounded a little disingenuous, and it sounded like a scare tactic to say 50% of people are providing for everybody else, where that's just simply not how welfare works. And Tanya Plibersek brought up a great point where she talked about how, when I need welfare, I do it, but then when I get back on my feet, I work and I can help provide for other people, and that's the social safety net. It not only is it the right thing to do for everybody, it's beneficial for everybody. It lifts everybody up. So, I also wanted to talk about when he's talking about the people who are paying taxes, and it's 50% of people who are providing all the benefits for the rest of society, and I'll provide a link to this down below, what about the 38% of large corporations who pay zero taxes? So, I mean, I guess he's saying he would... I mean, especially when we are subsidizing certain industries and stuff like that as well. So that's the idea of corporate welfare at the same time. So these corporations aren't contributing, yet they are still receiving benefits. So it's a little bit interesting that he talks about the people who are paying and the bludgers who are clinging on, and he doesn't talk about the large corporations who aren't paying any taxes. And he really hammered on that conservative talking point of dole bludgers. He specifically used the term dole bludgers, and the assumption that they must always be brought to book. And he said it in such a way, with such insouciance, that everybody knows. We don't want to support the dole bludgers. They have to be brought to book. And I think it is a very popular stance in society, and most people don't want to support the bludgers. But when you frame it in that way, when you call them dole bludgers, and you talk about how they're just mooching off of everybody else, it kind of ignores the realities of what puts a lot of these people into this position, the disenfranchised youth, where we all know about the troubles with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, the elderly, people who are long-term unemployed, people who are underskilled, people who have had mental health issues. So a lot of these people, a lot of the reasons why they're dole bludgers, they might technically be able to work, but there's a larger sociological issue there that are based on structural factors. So it's not. I think it's incorrect to frame it strictly as dole bludgers. Oh, there goes my cat. And part of the purpose of the dole is what I talked about earlier, bringing these people towards self-sufficient. And I also want to mention as well. So yeah, okay. So this all came about talking about the bungling of Centrelink and the furor reviews of budgets and all these kinds of things. And he starts talking about, obviously we want to not support people who don't want to support themselves, but there is. Well, it's a minority, but it's growing, and it's an ever-growing vocal minority of people who do believe in, and I'm one of them, universal basic income. So, I guess that would go against the grain of what he was saying of, obviously we don't want to support people who don't want to support themselves, when, people who support the idea of universal basic income, and if you do some research about it, you can see the pros and the cons of it. That's not necessarily an assumption we can all make. And when you see how much money must be spent reviewing people with disability, when so many of them, the lady who told her story, she was checked, she had a review 6 years ago, and she's had letters sent in by her doctors and specialists to say she is not fit for work, and yet they're still spending money reviewing her case. And how much money are they saving versus how much money are they spending on reviews by kicking people off of disability who they deem are able to work, and how many people might they incorrectly throw off of disability, and the burden that these reviews put on people. I don't know, it seems a little overwrought to me. And speaking of the Centrelink bungle, so Julian Burnside made a fantastic point here about putting the onus on the taxpayer to disprove the claim. So Centrelink automatically sends out a letter saying, you need to pay because you owe this much money, and you need to prove otherwise if it's not true. Like, there's so many things wrong with this system. I can't imagine anybody disagreeing, but George Brandis and Piers Akerman tried to defend it. You can't just have a government who can, or any authority, any company, any position of power, just sending out bills and putting all of the onus on the customer to disprove that bill, especially at the kind of scale that Centrelink have done it. Because first of all, how many people are just going to pay the bill? How many people are too disenfranchised, too socially awkward, suffering from mental illness, they're too stressed that they will just go ahead and do it, and suddenly it's sucking money out of people's pockets. And the burden it puts on the lady in the audience told the story of it took her several weeks, 1.5 hours waiting every day to try to rectify her claim. And I have a friend recently who was just telling me how she waited for an hour and a half on the phone and an hour and a half in the Centrelink, and nothing was even resolved at the end of that. Like, how much of a burden and is this bureaucracy of Centrelink? Another positive for universal basic income would be the elimination of a lot of this bureaucracy, but that's a discussion for another day. We got onto clean energy. There was a large discussion on clean energy. I don't think there's really too much to talk about here. It's less about clean energy and more about George Brandis and Piers Akerman and how they defended their stance on clean energy. So, first of all, I'll say I want to agree with Tanya in saying that investing more into coal-fired power stations will just be increasing costs. Like in a very similar way of investing in the cheaper NBN is going to increase costs because it's going to be outdated soon. So if we invest into the coal power stations, we're also still going to have to invest in renewables in the future. Piers Akerman really showed his true colors on this. I didn't actually know too much about Piers Akerman going into this. I've done some research on him now, but his defense for the position was of why Labour can't be trusted was he quoted Penny Wong from 8 years ago to claim that Labour's current revised position is a flip-flop, and that to me seems patently absurd. Again, to use the NBN as an example, it would be akin to claiming that Labour's position on the NBN going into the last election was a flip-flop because they didn't want to start all over again and do fibre to the premise. They wanted to use the existing infrastructure that had already been built by the coalition and then finish the rest of it with the proper fibre technology to the premise. And I think it's kind of similar. Circumstances change, and policy needs to adjust. And this is 8 years ago, sorry. 8 years prior, this Penny Wong quote. Like, you need slightly better ammunition, I think, going into this, especially because if something like climate change, 8 years is a big difference as well. Like the science has changed. The world is even hotter. Targets need to be changed. Everything needs to be altered. So the thing I would stress is when talking about these big parties, is it's not about whether or not they flip-flopped. It's about what policy they are promoting today. I suppose the idea of they flip-flop means you can't trust them on this policy today, but I don't think we really need to. I mean, that's kind of getting into paranoia territory there if we're trying to say that the position from 8 years ago means they're not going to follow through on this promise. They're not going to attempt it. And Piers Akerman again returned to the lie about South Australia renewables being to blame for their power problems. We got into discussing community legal aid, and so I did a little fact check. So there was a big argument between George Brandis and Tanya Plibersek, where George Brandis. So a question from the audience was about the problem within the family court system and how long await periods there are, and Tanya Plibersek accused George Brandis of cutting funding from community legal centres. And George Brandis' defense was, no, that was a Labour policy and it was designed to terminate after 4 years. Can people not see what's wrong with that argument? Like, well, then why don't you just extend it? So they got into a debate where Tanya Plibersek said at the last election we went in with a policy saying we were going to increase funding. We weren't just going to terminate it after the 4 years. Just because it says after 4 years, or, you know, her argument was that's how all budgeting is done, through 4-year blocks. So I did a little fact checking and I'll post the link down below. Labour did go to the 2016 election with a promise to expand community legal aid. I don't understand why someone like George Brandis, why he has to I mean, is it even? It's not even lying, but it's so manipulative and so deceptive to say, oh, this is okay. So we're cutting money from here, but it's Labour's fault. He already promoted another. Saying they're increasing funding to $200 million to combat domestic violence in other ways, and that's fantastic. But why are you trying to use this doublespeak, this kind of manipulation, this chicanery, when you can just be honest and just say, look, we believe that the most of that money dedicated towards community legal was to help combat domestic violence, and we've increased funding to combat domestic violence in another way. Now that you've brought it to our attention, we can take it back to the party. Now that we know it's a big issue in the community, it's been televised in a live debate, we're going to discuss it and rethink our issues. Why do you have to try and play this party game of blaming Labour? And I'm not saying this is something that strictly Conservatives do, or the Liberal National Party, the coalition. Labour does it too, and almost every politician through time does it. That's what's one of the harder things to watch about Q&A to me, is when the big party candidates are discussing and it's just talking points, this, deflection, doublespeak. Oh, and then when you get somebody real on, who just says it like it is, they say it because they mean it, because they believe it, because it's the truth, and it's occurred to them there. It's like it's so refreshing. And lastly, not leastly, well, we got on to refugees again. So the pollster, let me just check her name, Michele, Levine, CEO of Roy Morgan Research, did a poll just for that, just for this Q&A, and she found that 50% of Australians are torn between whether we should bring refugees to Australia or keep them offshore, send them to another country, etc. She found that everybody is opposed to what's going on in these detention centers, to the humanitarian crisis that it is, but it's about whether we bring them here or send them home. Given that how much money Australia already spends keeping them offshore, I know that it's come down a little, seeing as there's less boats coming now. I have always favoured processing them onshore. So the number one reason why people who are opposed to onshore processing is because they're worried about, do we have enough houses, do we have enough infrastructure for them? I think spend the money we use keeping them offshore, invest it into infrastructure, which we should already be investing into in greater lengths already. So if we were already investing into local policy, domestic policy, and infrastructure already, it would be far less of an issue. So I guess that was the only thing I have to say. Oh, I'll bring up one last thing, and that is when Piers Akerman was indignant when they said that Trump's ban was a Muslim ban. They didn't. So Tanya, Plibersek, and those arguing that it was a Muslim ban, they didn't specifically refer to the ban, the legislation. They said Trump wanted to ban Muslims, which you can find footage of that over and over again, of him saying ban Muslims, it's a Muslim ban, and then when they went to introduce it, they said it's not a Muslim ban. So there is a little bit of grey there, because it's only certain countries, it's not all Muslims, but oh, you can see my cat in the background jumping up. I mean, clearly it's dedicated towards certain countries and almost seemingly arbitrarily, and it's dedicated towards the Muslims in those countries predominantly. So I don't think it's that controversial to call it a Muslim ban when that's clearly what Donald Trump's intention was the whole time, and they went to a lot of effort to make sure it was to try to make it legal. Turned out not to be legal, and it definitely seems like discrimination against religion. So those are my final comments on that episode of QandA. If you watch this episode, you have any comments, leave them below. Check out some of the links I've put on this video. Maybe hit subscribe. Cool. Thank you.